This is the sound of your ride home with Dad after he caught you vaping. Awkward, isn't it? Most vapes contain seriously addictive levels of nicotine and disappointment. Know the real cost of vapes. Brought to you by the FDA.
Manchester's indie rock and roll station, XS Manchester. The XS Manchester Long Player, an iconic album in full with Jim Salverson. XS Manchester.
Hello and welcome to another XS Long Player, a classic album deep dived upon with one of the people that made it. Today, the album we're discussing on the Long Player is Stereo MC's third album, Connected. Era-defining, Mercury Music Prize nominated, and from back in 1992. We'll get into all that shortly with Rob Birch from Stereo MCs, who talks us through the album. Before we get into it, don't forget the links to listen back to the album, if you're inspired to do so, are in the episode descriptions. And if you like this episode, there's plenty more to go out in the back catalogue of the XS Long Player, including a chat with Mike Edwards from Jesus Jones about the album Doubt, and an episode with Gary Whelan talking about Happy Mondays, pills, thrills and bellyaches. I reckon if you're into this, you'll probably be into those as well. But for now, it's all about Stereo MCs and Connected on the XS Long Player. Rob, welcome to the XS Long Player.
Hey, thanks. Thank you very much.
Lovely to talk to you about this classic album. Going back to 1992 for this one to talk about Connected, which I guess is halfway through the band's story, 1992. Third album. You just signed to a major record label. Going into the making of Connected, did it feel different to what had come before?
Well, the whole thing is like you're growing all the time, so nothing really feels the same. Every record you make feels different and has a different sort of energy to it, and it's a different experience when you go in the studio. And it all seems like it went really quickly. When I look back at it now, I just think, it just seemed to be, it all went very fast, and things were just done on the spot, writing songs and making songs. And, we had a certain amount of material already together when we went in the studio. And then we actually wrote songs from scratch whilst we were sort of mixing other tracks. So we were definitely had a lot of momentum. I'd say that was a key factor in the making of the record.
Did it feel pressured in any way? That relentlessness, I guess, of kind of like you come off tour, you have to make a new album, you've got some of it ready, you're recording bits, you're writing bits. It's very full on at that stage. Was that adding pressure, but also the presence of the big label that were backing you for this one?
Well, to be honest, Island were with us for our first three albums. So again, the thing I liked about Island was the fact that it was an independent label, and they supported us by actually helping us to develop rather than giving us vast amounts of money personally. So we had a small advance, but they helped us get onto tours and they paid for our studio time. So it was a positive relationship, and it wasn't a sort of self-indulgent relationship. It was always realistically being creative, And I'd say in terms of pressure, we were sort of used to it, really, because since we started and we started our own label, G Street Records, and then Island licensed us from there for Fall from Broadway. We'd be out on the road and we'd be recording, and there'd be tours, and everything it was a journey which you just somehow took in your stride. And there were deadlines, and you had to do this and that and the other on deadlines. It was old school. So you'd be going to doing everything, you had to go somewhere and do it. You couldn't do anything really at home, on the internet, because it wasn't there. So photographs and interviews, everything was about going somewhere. And it was, to be honest, I thought it was really exciting. And because you're young and you're full of energy and it's all new to you, you sort of embrace that sort of pressure, and you've got nothing to lose anyway, because you just, you're living in some little rented apartment, just making music in your living room, living on beans on toast. And, what have you got to lose? You just throw everything you've got at it, and you have to look at it sort of like, I'm committed to this 100%. Everyone else has to be sort of understanding of it that's around you, your friends and girlfriends and family. They just have to understand that your number one priority is doing music.
One of the big changes, I guess, between this album and the first two albums, I might be wrong here, but I think there was a big change in the world of sampling because the 80s had very much been the wild west of sampling. The art was ahead of the law, it was one step ahead. But by the time we got to 1992, I think the law was kind of catching up. Did that mean you had to change your approach to where you found and how you use the samples in your music?
Not in any way whatsoever. Not in terms of choosing samples anyway. We always looked at sampling as really you had to go about it in a unique way and try to use samples in an original manner and try to look for samples that were unusual. So you didn't just automatically go for the funky drummer, when you were looking for beats. You tried to be original in your usage of breaks. And it was the way you combine breaks that made your music. It was the juxtaposition of a Latin record to Liberace, that would make something unique happen. It was like cooking. The spices you add to the pot is what makes it. And so it was all about originality. And yeah, sure enough, the wolves were at the door in terms of you're trying to catch you by 1992 for using samples. And if it was obvious that, you had a sample on there that could be identified, then, fair enough. It's like, we didn't have a problem with coming out and saying, yeah, we use this sample and you have to settle up with the artist and the publisher and the record company. But I don't think we looked at it as a problem. Really, the priority was always, this is a great track, and no matter what, we've got to make it happen. Whatever clearance we've got to get on it.
Was there an element there of you, like you say, you put the art first and you worried about the other people could worry about the other stuff? I spoke to Mike Edwards from Jesus Jones on this series, and he kind of said similar things to what you've just said in terms of, look, if it was out there and it was obvious, then there was a fair and legitimate route. But if you could get away with stuff, you would get away with stuff at the same time.
To be honest, I think we just used our musical capabilities to overcome hurdles. For instance, on some tracks, maybe it started with a break, but then we ended up playing the break, and finding ways to actually physically reproduce the break beat or whatever it was we'd used. So in some ways, we wouldn't actually have to ask for permission to use the recording, which could sometimes be a problem if an artist was particularly precious, like some artists from back in the day were. Although, to be honest, a lot of really good artists were quite cool about it. We just we know other musicians and we can play a few instruments ourselves. And, we had a drummer. And, besides, sometimes a break will just point to an idea. And you may end up not even using the break and just going, well, that was just a spark of inspiration, but it led us somewhere. I don't think we worried too much about it. We always thought that we're just going to make it happen somehow.
I imagine looking for those breaks and looking for those samples is a hugely exciting part of the creative process. When you look back at this album now, when you listen back at this album and you hear those moments, does it take you back to however you found them, whether it was browsing record shops or listening to the radio, whatever it was? Can you kind of be transported back by hearing those moments?
Yeah, time is a weird thing. It's it feels like yesterday. And I can remember a lot of moments where, going down little basement places in Camden where there used to be a really good little place around the back of the market where this guy and his son used to sell records, and they'd have a special section just for breaks. And they knew what they were talking about. And they'd have this section so you didn't have to trawl through loads and loads of stuff to find breaks, because it wasn't like I was being a musical purist. I really didn't care where the breaks came from. It could have been Bill and Ben go to the shops one day, or it could be a famous jazz record. I really wasn't bothered where the break come from. It was really the quality of the break and had anyone used it and, stuff like that. So you were just looking for original material. And I do remember certain moments. I remember when we looped up the bass line for Connected. I remember the exact moment that I looped it up, looking out the window over Lavender Hill in Battersea from our living room. I was looking out the window as I was looping it up on our echo unit. And I remember actually finding the break. It was a tiny portion where there was no horns and no singing. And it was just literally boom, chat. That was it. But I just found this tiny portion. Breaks, they have a charisma, right? That's what I think the art to finding breaks is. You find something that actually has sonic charisma and it just goes, this really is magnetic and it just has something about it. I remember being on a bus and getting the melody line for the chorus. And I remember walking down the stairs in the flat and the idea for it being connected coming into my head. They're just little moments and, moments in the studio when that was a beautiful thing back in them days that all them people would work together in a studio and mix a record together and there'd be, 4 or 5 people on the mixing board to do a mix. It was a sort of a magical happening that had to happen within a certain space of time. There wasn't unlimited studio time and everybody, had to get paid there. So you had to get your stuff together. You were present as a human being. Yeah.
We're going to come back to Connected shortly and talk about that. But before we do that, I want to talk about the tour that was before the album, because I think the album came straight off the back of you going on tour with the Happy Mondays, which I'm sure at the time gave you plenty of war stories to tell. But I want to know whether there was any musical influence on the album, because when I listen back to this record, I think there's a couple of moments that I'd say were Mondays-esque. So was there any kind of musical fingerprints from them on your work?
It's a really difficult question to answer because you never really are aware of where your influences are coming from. When you're making, like when you're writing, you're making a tune, you're just so excited about what you're doing that everything is like a huge melting pot. So I couldn't really say that Mondays were a reference for us, but I think the effect of touring with them was quite profound. In between Supernatural and Connected, we were out on the road in America with the Mondays. And I think it was the first time that we'd actually toured with another band because we supported a lot of bands in those days to try to reach different sorts of audiences. And it was the first time that we supported a band where their audience were very open to what we did. And it was a perfect audience for us to play to. But not only that, the Mondays themselves were the first major group that actually treated us in a really decent fashion.
Right.
They were into what we were doing and they made sure that we had a sound check, whereas some groups would quite deliberately like fuck you up, so you actually didn't get a sound check. They made sure that we had good volume because a lot of groups also go, right, support band, you keep your level down because when we go on, we want to be on maximum volume, not you. So they actually really looked after us and it was a very nice atmosphere to play with them. And I always like being on the stage with the Mondays because there's just a good vibe about it. There's a nice atmosphere. The atmosphere is like a coming together of so many different influences, like in the crowd itself, from rap music to rock music to there's so many influences in there that it's a positive vibration for you to get up there. The effect for us was through touring with them. We progressed as a band. We actually, it helped us to move forward.
I guess one of the reasons it is difficult to pinpoint whether there were influences there from working with the band is because creative people like yourself are generally sponges and you kind of absorb things from all over the place and you don't know necessarily where you are absorbing something from. But B, the Mondays in themselves have, as you just highlighted, so many different musical influences and so many different things going on in their music that those have come from somewhere anyway in the first place. Do you ever remember sitting down with the band with Sean and actually discussing music at any point? Because I think the impression you get of the Mondays is when they're off stage on tour, they're all about having fun. They're not going to talk business. But did you have those conversations?
No, strangely enough, we never did. When you're touring, it's really hectic. You're traveling, You got to get sound check, and everything, for me personally, everything is focused to that hour to hour and a half that you've got to play. Your whole day starts and you're thinking about 9:30, when do I eat? When do I warm up? And everything for me is focused on that. I I don't think about too much about hanging out too much. If you just sit down with someone for a cup of tea, all right. But we never really did that. Everybody was just like, you were there for the gig and then you were out. It was like that. And occasionally, through the dressing room door, you have a chat with Bez or, sometimes Sean. But it's usually they're quite like if I chat with Bez, it's quite a supernatural kind of conversation. It's a conversation where Bez is a very intense guy, and when you have a conversation with him, it's important that you meet his intensity. Otherwise, it's a waste of time, I think. You have to meet his intensity and try to really concentrate on where Bez is coming from. I think Bez has a lot to say, but he exists on a slightly different way of thinking to most people. But whereas Sean is more, he's right down there. He's like in a different place. And I guess that's a bit like me and Nick, really. We're both polar opposites in a lot of ways. But then it's quite good to be mates with someone who has different attributes to what you have. Otherwise, what have you got to offer each other in a lot of ways? So yeah, we never talked about music at all.
When I was doing a bit of research for this album and looking back at reviews and all that kind of thing of when it came out in 1992, one of the words that kept on popping up time and time again, Rob, was the term era-defining. And I was curious as to whether that was something you set out to do. As a band, we always kind of try to do something a little bit different, something that moved the needle a bit.
I mean, there's always a drive to be different. I think it was very highly strung in those days. It was all about trying to come out with a tune that was original. That was really high on the agenda. You wanted to get lost in the sound and in the music and be hypnotized by groove, but you also wanted it to be an original vibe, to go somewhere that someone else hadn't been yet. I don't think we see ourselves or saw ourselves as pioneers. We were just riding the wave. A lot of people were energized by it that time. We were part of on the outskirts of a sort of musical revolution that was taking everybody on board, including everyone who was making hip hop music and house music, as well as people like the Mondays and Stone Roses and people like that, because it all reached back to Kraftwerk and early dub and how the spoken word started being put onto dance music. So I think everybody was affected by it. And it was an energy that was around that everybody, if you were inspired by that, you rode it. You just had to get on and ride and hope that your journey was going to take you somewhere.
I want to talk about a couple of specific tracks from the album, if that's okay. And then I'd like you to maybe pick a couple of moments or tracks or songs or memories from the album that take you back to the studio when you were making it. Obviously, we've talked about Connected already. That's where I want to start because I want to fact check a couple of things about it that I've read and I want to know if they're true or not. But is it right that when you were putting Connected together, the lyric part of that song, you jammed in just 2 takes? And was that typical of how you tended to work writing lyrics?
I wouldn't like to say it's typical, but how else do you get an idea? If you're not jamming in your head, if you're listening to a tune, whether you get out on the mic or you're just vibing on it, you're kind of jamming in your head anyway. And maybe sometimes you'll listen to something and you'll go, oh, that's giving me an idea. And so you run with it. But with Connected, we already had the chorus line. We just couldn't figure out the verses. And that can be really tricky, and you have a chorus and you just kind of go, yeah, but what's this tune about? And you don't really know what it's about. In the end, because I wrote raps for it and, that didn't seem to be happening. And, I tried various ideas and that didn't seem to be happening. In the end, they just said, just go and jam. And they looped up the refrain that actually just looped it throughout the track, put some echo on the mic. And they just said, just go out and vibe on it. And I did. You sort of go naked in a way when you do that. You just kind of go, okay, well, I don't know what I'm going to do. And sometimes that's quite a good place to be. And that's what happened. Yeah, it's a couple of takes really. And that was it.
I guess the opposite of that would probably be a tune like Ground Level, which was a song that was inspired by the challenges of being inner city life, the tensions in Brixton, where you guys were based at the time. Did you tend to lyrically take a lot of inspiration from the news agenda, from social observations, and that kind of stuff?
Well, to be honest, that track that actually wanted to talk about that track because that track was written in an afternoon. I went down Red Records and down in Brixton, which was one of my favourite shops for buying 12 inches, and they had a little rack of breaks. And I found a couple of breaks in there, and I had a couple of breaks from Camden, and I strapped a few things together. Pretty much the whole song was written in and put together within about 4 or 5 hours. And I didn't really sit around banging my head on a wall to get the lyrics. They just poured out. I don't understand it. I don't know where it came from. I just think it's an unconscious passage of energy that comes from you having absorbed your environment, and your environment finds its way to come out of you again. That was a really beautiful tune, that one.
Are they your favorite moments as a musician when it just seems to happen effortlessly? Or do you prefer the grind? Do you prefer coming out of something you're really proud of when you've spent months, days, years working on it?
If you find a good end, then it's all good, right? But some things you just have to say, well, I've done that, but it's probably never going to see the light of day. But it's not a waste of time because that's part of your job as a musician. You just like, you just got to turn up and work and do music. And not every day you're going to be inspired. It's like, that's just life. So when inspiration does hit, you kind of need to be at the wheel and do something with it. And those inspired moments where you just kind of, some lyrics roll out of you and you just go, well, that's like a bit of poetry, man. It's like, wow. And you don't know where it's come from. And there is a certain beauty to it because it's so innocent and it's not thought about. Those are the moments that I don't like to say favorites, so much. I don't like favoritism as a concept, but they have a certain beauty to them because of the way they happen. They do resonate with me, moments like that. You can't help but resonate with them because of the way they happen, because you strive to reach that point. Whenever you write, that's really what you're looking for. You can write loads of stuff and then you look back and you go, ah, sounds a bit dry, right? It's like, it sounds like I really thought hard about this and it's like, it's just too obvious or whatever. Being a writer can be, that's how it is. Yeah, you have to let go of stuff.
I've stolen one of your moments already from this album, but is there another track or another part of the album that you want to kind of dwell on, that you want to pull the memories out of?
There's an instrumental track that we did called Fever. It wasn't actually, I don't think it was actually on the album, but we made it at the same time as the album, and it was on the B side of maybe Connected or one of the singles.
Right.
And it was a track called Fever, and I really loved that track. I think that went out as almost like world music, and the remix was done of it and stuff, and it went on. It did quite well in that area of music, but I really liked the vibe of it because it had all, we used a lot of horns in them days, and we had a string section, and it was lovely to do that. And I've actually played the B3 organ on it, the Hammond organ,
Sure.
and they're fantastic instruments. It's like when you go in a studio and they've got the proper B3 Hammond organ and they wind up the revolving cabinet and it sounds like some old biplane starting up, and the speakers revolve, they revolve as to pump out the sound, and it's all humming and vibrating, and you start playing this old organ and winding up the vibrato and stuff, and it's just an incredible piece of machinery. It's like, wow. And you play that along on your track and you feel like you're in some kind of old black and white fight with heaven and hell movie sort of thing, and your hair's all being blown back by the wind, and like it's just like it's a right vibe playing them instruments. Yeah, I really loved that tune. Like I say, we had some moments where we had string sections in, which was also really beautiful because, a lot of the time you have string sections down and they'll have someone who's like counting every minute that they're playing, and they're writing it all down as, oh, is that a B flat or a D diminished, and I'm like, I don't know. I can just sing it to you, right? And I can sing you the harmonies, and I can sing you what I want. I'm just not musically trained, but luckily the string section we had down were very cool guys, and I just had to sing it to them, and they just got the picture and were totally flexible and cool about it, and they were really special, man. Yeah.
This was an absolutely huge album for you guys. It was number 2 in the charts, Mercury nominated alongside PJ Harvey, New Order, Suede that were on that list for the Mercury as well. It felt like at that time that you were ready to take over the world, and then suddenly nothing. It took another decade to make a record. What happened?
Well, I guess by the time we'd finished touring, I think we got a little bit what's the word for it? Overexposed.
Hmm.
We'd just been out on the road for so long, we sort of lost touch with normal life. And it's a bit like losing touch with your roots. It actually is a bit damaging to your creative pathway. Personally, that's how I felt about it. I
Right.
just felt like I was disconnected from what I wanted to do, and I wasn't sure creatively where I was going anymore. Having thoughts like, have I already met the goals that I wanted to meet? Where do I go from here? How do I write? And it wasn't like we all went on holiday. We pretty much went straight back in the studio. It's just that creatively it wasn't working. And there's not much you can say about that. It's like you can't force creativity to happen. Creativity has to be a sort of natural thing, and you still turn up every day, but it's like something's not happening here. So in the end, we had to go and build a studio and go back to being like we used to be, which is sort of creating a second living room where we could record again without there being anybody around us, because we were using commercial recording studios to record in, and it was all on the clock and paying for it and all of that. And we had to go back to how we used to be back in the day, the sort of living room vibe, and go back to our roots, if you like, back in Brixton, and try to unravel this mystery as to why we weren't being positively creative. We were working, we were coming up with, there's a whole bag full of, got a whole bag full of record bag full of floppy disks of, there must be like 300 floppy disks in there of tunes that we made in that period, but that we couldn't finish. So there was a stumbling block, which, yeah, I still can't really fathom it, to be honest. But you know,
It feels like there's a special edition box set to be released at some point of all the unheard demos. But let's fast
no,
forward.
they're way gone. No.
Let's fast forward to 2024 because it's been a while since you've made any new music, obviously. But you're back on the road. You're touring. You're going to be in Manchester this November. What's it been like getting back on stage again?
Well, it's been the same as it has been for the last 20 years, because we've been touring pretty solidly since we put out Deep Down and Dirty, which was in 2001, and we haven't really stopped being on the road every year since then. So it's nothing new, except that as a band, I think our performances improve. And thankfully, I still feel the same excitement getting onto a stage. I still feel the same nervous energy. And I still want to run 10 miles away from the venue when it's time to actually hit the stage. So that part hasn't really changed.
Excuse the pun here, but do you still feel a connection to the songs that you did now we're 30 plus years down the line? These are songs that you wrote in the early 90s. Here we are in 2024. Do they still feel familiar? Do they still feel something that's like it's come from you?
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, we put those tracks together. It's like, how can you not feel a connection to them? They're like little children. They're little creations. They're little entities that came out of creativity. So you may fall out with one of them, but you always get back together again. And I don't get it when people say, "Oh, we had a hit record. It's the biggest nightmare of my life." I just don't get it. I'm just like, how can you say that? millions of musicians would love to have a record that does well. And if you're lucky enough to be one of the few that has one that actually does well, it's like, how can you ever regret it? It's like looking at the creation itself and being ungrateful. It's like, you've got to be eternally grateful for that stroke of good fortune that you just happened to walk down that street that day and had that idea and just go, wow, aren't I lucky? And so I always feel a connection to those songs, and I'm still always look forward to playing them, especially Connected, because it's a good tune, and I can see why people like it because the groove is good, and every time we play it, I get excited. I guess I'm just not jaded by it all. I just kind of think, yeah, no big deal for me. I'm a soldier when it comes to music. I'm there for the music, right?
What a great note to finish on. Rob, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you about the Stereo MCs classic album Connected and your plans for the next few months as well. We look forward to seeing you in Manchester, but thanks so much for your time.
Yeah,
on the
me
XS
too,
Long Player.
man. Yeah, nice. Peace to everybody there.
The XS Manchester Long Player, an iconic album in full with Jim Salverson. XS Manchester.
How good was it to hear from Rob talking about Stereo MCs Connected? That was the album on today's XS Long Player. If you want to listen back to the album, or if you want to find those links to the episodes that I mentioned at the top of the show, Gaz Whelan talking about Happy Mondays, Pills, Thrills, and also Mike from Jesus Jones talking about Doubt, then the links to that are in the podcast description as well, along with a link to the Stereo MCs website where you will find the latest live dates. They're on tour at the moment, but obviously it depends when you listen to this podcast to what the status is. Check the website, find where they're playing near you, and go and check out an iconic band from the 90s. Right, that's it for today. Make sure you've clicked subscribe because there's plenty more episodes on the way as we deep dive on more classic albums on the XS Long Player.
The XS Manchester Long Player, an iconic album in full with Jim Salverson. XS Manchester.